City-State Solution: How to Avoid a Civil War or National Secession in These Disunited States. An introductory note. In this piece, I'll be relaying some information that may seem like support and defenses of both the left and the right. So anyone staunchly adherent to one side may find some discomfort in some of the things that I say. But in the spirit of trying to find resolution and peace for as many people as possible, I ask anyone who finds themselves strongly identified with either end of the political spectrum to please listen to the entire presentation with an open mind and reserve critiques and disagreements until the end, at which point I encourage you to voice any objections, questions, or concerns that remain in the comments below. A print version of this content is available at evanmontry.substack.com. Tensions in the USA have continued to escalate ever since the 2016 election. And now, with so much widespread animosity and hostile rhetoric, talk of civil war and secession, or national divorce, has become a part of mainstream discourse. But most of this talk continues to be mistakenly focused upon an apparent rift between blue states and red states, which completely overlooks the actual divergence that has occurred. When we map our current political polarization geographically, it's quite clearly not a divide between blue states and red states, but between the urban population centers we call cities and the more rural countryside terrains and towns. Looking at electoral maps of New York State at the precinct level, we can see that New York is mostly Republican red. Most of the precincts and counties that make up most of the area of the state voted for Trump and Republican representatives. While a few counties and college towns are centrist or lean Democrat blue, it's only New York City that skews so heavily to the left, with 85% or more voting Democrat in some districts. A relatively tiny area, but so dense of a population that it swings the entire state to Democrat blue. The same goes for California, with the densely populated coastal areas around LA and the San Francisco Bay Area voting large majority Democrat, but being much smaller in size than the rest of the very large state, which votes mostly Republican. People often refer to California as a whole representing a deeply progressive leftist state, but they forget that California has had more Republicans than any other state until Texas took that mantle just a few years ago. The same type of political geographic divide occurs for Chicago in Illinois, Seattle in Washington, Portland in Oregon, Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth. It's often said that there really are no red states and blue states, but only red states with blue islands. Of course, these are very densely populated islands, and a common retort against attention being brought to the geographical distribution of voters is that land doesn't vote, people do. An argument that, of course, bears validity in many contexts, but this dismissal neglects the underlying issues of localism, regionalism, and the decentralization of representative government, concepts that are foundational to how America was structured and framed, and ones I'll review here, along with the stark cultural and political division itself that exists between these two types of populations, regardless of their relative size. In this treatise, I'm going to explore the various reasons for this divide, beyond simplistic reductions to mere demographic differences. I'll elaborate a plethora of reasons why cities are inherently leftist, and I'll explain how numerous leftist policies actually do make more practical and logical sense in cities, and why more rural areas naturally favor rightist policies. And I'll elucidate several reasons these divergences will always exist and only grow more acute as the 21st century progresses, such as different drivers of migratory trends as well as three distinct aspects of technological advancement. And while I'll be focusing on America and its uncommon federated structure, keep in mind, especially if you are not a U.S. citizen yourself, that these trends and explanations for these trends I'll be providing still apply to all Western nations and probably a great extent to all nations globally. I'll also review some of the arguments both for and against national-level secession, the arguments for a return to a more decentralized federalism, and how both of these areas of discourse are generally lacking attention to a specific factor which may represent the only real solution to our ever-increasing division and the only way to avoid widespread violence, nightmarish warfare, and other forms of systemic social collapse. A solution that is not at all unfeasible and has the real potential for robust bipartisan support. And even if national secession, either through peaceful separation or civil war, does inevitably occur, then the truths and observations detailed here will remain equally relevant and significant in any future resolutions and reconstructions that would take place following such a transformation. And I'll conclude by addressing some of the potential objections and obstacles to what I am proposing. It should be clear by now, and by the title of this piece, that the solution I'm referring to is the separation of major urban areas into new states in the Union, whether by their own secession into a new state or by the secession of the surrounding non-urban counties into a new state. Such state-level secessions have happened before, Maine from Massachusetts, Tennessee from North Carolina, and both Kentucky and West Virginia from Virginia. And there are such efforts currently underway in a number of states. So I feel this topic deserves far, far more attention than it has been getting, especially compared to how much national secession is in the limelight, with various books and articles on the topic being regularly published these days. National secession itself is already a popular idea, with various polls over the past 6 years showing anywhere from 25 to 39% overall supporting it. These days, it's easy to understand why Republicans, libertarians, and right-wingers in general might favor national secession with their vocal "don't tread on me" sentiment and increasingly prominent resistance to being governed by small and distant yet highly populated cities whose culture they find alien and offensive. However, contrary to what some may assume, Democrats, who, bear in mind, tend to live in cities, actually favor national secession over Republicans, with 42% in favor compared to 35% of Republicans, according to a 2018 Zogby poll. And blacks, who live in urban areas at even higher rates than the average Democrat, favor secession at 47%, and it's nearly half. And according to a newer poll, which, mind you, took place during the Biden administration, not Trump's, 47% of all Democrats in the Pacific region, that includes California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, favor seceding from the U.S. With numbers this high, I believe that if the less dramatic and less complex version of essentially the same idea, state-level secessions instead of national, was presented properly, the support levels could easily climb to large majorities well over 50%. Before I begin explaining some of the rational reasons and ensuing benefits for leftists of having cities separate into new states, I'll just address one concern people may have regarding how this might affect representation, since 2 new senators would be added to Congress for every new state formed. If the rural counties secede from a blue state, leaving the more densely populated and urban areas behind, this will add 2 more Republican senators to Congress. If the urban counties comprising a city secede from a red state, leaving behind the rural counties, then this will add 2 Democrat senators. I checked, and there's approximately an equal number of large cities in both red states and blue states. So if the top 25 or even the top 50 most populous cities all separated from their respective states, the balance of power in Congress would likely remain the same. However, aside from the push to make D.C. a state, the state-level secession movements gaining the most legal traction at the current time appear to be mostly efforts by red counties attempting to secede from blue states. So unless you Democrats living in blue cities in red states or swing states don't mind an increasingly Republican Senate, you should perhaps start rallying behind your local city secession movement, or create one if it doesn't yet exist. However, even if you are a leftist in a city in a blue state, where the red counties all leave, this is still something that will benefit you immensely, as you will then face dramatically less obstacles and obstructions to your efforts in governing your urban communities the way you truly desire. Just imagine having an 80% progressive leftist voting base to more freely shape the laws and budgeting of your city. How much faster you could build the green techno-ecotopia smart city paradise that so many envision. How much easier it would be to pass universal basic income programs, universal healthcare, more progressive tax structures, and any number of leftist social, environmental, and economic policies that currently face fierce opposition from the state legislatures and other state-level governing entities representing the numerous non-urban Republican-controlled counties in your state. Of course, as I try to entice the metropolitan left with such ideas and visions, there will be some right-wingers who are snickering and scoffing, "Yeah, good luck with all that communism. Just don't come crying back to us when it all collapses." But those on the right should first remember that inasmuch as local governments are supposed to address the local cultural needs and geological and bioregional aspects of the locality, cities and rural counties are as divergent as can be. And then consider that not only do leftist and socialistic policies, such as welfare states, actually have a much better success rate the smaller a nation is and the more politically unified it is, but also that these types of policies often do make much more sense in cities specifically. For instance, strict environmental regulations make more sense in cities where 96% of all pollution comes from, but not as much in the open countryside where clean fresh air and water abound. And for those concerned about climate change, the vast majority of carbon emissions are also produced by cities. If a city gains independence from the surrounding state, they will be less hindered in implementing the strict carbon control measures and alternative energy subsidies that are resisted by the rest of the state, and directly in the location where it matters most. And it is in the cities where the most extreme income disparities exist, with the most impoverished and destitute living directly adjacent to some of the most lavishly wealthy people on the planet. So socialistic wealth redistribution naturally has more appeal in the cities, certainly more than in rural areas where the differences between low and high income lifestyles is not nearly as stark and dramatic. In rural areas, a lower-income citizen will likely have a house with a yard and a garden, and of course a car and maybe a truck, while the most notable difference between them and an upper-income citizen is that the latter will have a house that is perhaps 2 or 3 times larger, and their car will be newer. Whereas metropolitan multimillionaires living in deluxe penthouses with expansive views must walk directly past disheveled and despondent homeless people asking for change every single day on the corner of the street that they live on. Neighborhoods with posh brownstones or apartment buildings with uniformed doormen standing in the Gothic entrances are often just mere blocks away from dilapidated low-income housing streets and slums. This sharp contrast is in constant view to all who live in cities. Cities are where the world's wealthiest go to play, party, and dine, and often live full-time, and they also house the largest populations of poor and struggling people, along with 99% of the homeless population. So the impulse towards more redistributive welfare states is perfectly natural. And cities just naturally require more government intervention and regulation for a litany of logical and pragmatic reasons, and therefore the residents are often quite welcoming of a robust public sector and, in turn, have the tendency to be pro-government and vote left. They rely on massive and complex government infrastructures to maintain adequate public sanitation, utilities, and public transportation. Most of the parks and museums they cherish so dearly as centrally important aspects of city life and culture are publicly owned and managed. And the vast majority of urban residents rent their apartments instead of owning property, so the regulatory environment ends up protecting their interests more than it limits their freedom. Some of the regulations common to cities are necessary simply due to such close proximity of all the residents, such as certain noise and volume ordinances, local trash codes, and developers having to abide planning commissions regarding views, sunlight blockage, and parking space. By necessity, being more closely crammed together in large numbers naturally leads to more collectivism on many levels, more hive-like regulatory and social structures. Individualism is more prevalent in rural areas because the people are more spread out and therefore more self-reliant. The closer people live together, the more dependent they are on the people around them to survive, and hence the more accustomed to that dependency they become. But there's also a socio-psychological phenomena that emerges within collectives known as diffusion of responsibility. A phenomena with a body of literature behind it that has been studied in myriad different contexts. The diffusion of responsibility refers to the tendency of people to take less and less individual responsibility as they are surrounded by more and more people, such as being less likely to help in an emergency if a group of others are also present, or less likely to individually contribute to a task that's been assigned to a group. And the larger the group is, the more this tendency manifests. The fact that this behavior is expressed in large scale within cities should not be taken as fodder for moral judgment by individualists, but instead recognized as a natural and inevitable feature of any large group living in close networked proximity. And the structure of city life constantly reinforces the diffusion of responsibility in countless various ways, always veering the individual away from personal responsibility, that ethos so central to Rightist thinking. Denizens of cities rely on public transportation rather than maintaining their own truck. They rely on public water rather than being responsible for their own $20,000 well. They don't have to chop firewood to keep warm in the winter, but instead pay for utilities reliant on government-maintained infrastructure. They don't have to worry about maintaining their property or curb appeal, since that's the landlord's job. City dwellers eschew responsibility for their personal safety to police, more so than those in rural areas where police response times are longer and therefore encourages more reliance on self-defense. The convenience of having every amenity, product, and form of entertainment practically within walking distance is one of the great and understandably celebrated luxuries of living in a big city, but it does tend to steer behavior and habit away from individual responsibility. People don't have to cook and prepare their meals if they prefer to simply use DoorDash or order delivery from any of the myriad local restaurants, or just take the elevator down to grab a midnight slice of pizza or a deli sandwich. Another socio-psychological reason metropolitan people tend to vote left for bigger and more centralized government has to do with the inherent lack of unified moral codes. Cities, with their extremely high population numbers, and also often home to people with very diverse cultures and backgrounds, do not have the same unified moral codes that localities and towns throughout history traditionally experienced. Historically, for instance, the church steeple was usually the tallest structure in a town, being a focal point of the town's physical layout as well as the town's culture, rituals, and traditions. Universal moral codes, such as those coming from religion, were reinforced by the people of the town or region and their culture. And when these are absent, it logically creates a demand for a larger and more interventionist government to fill the void of structure, hierarchy, and value system. In the open spaces of rural landscapes, communities more easily congregate around shared values and shared traditions, such as religion, so there are more culturally enforced codes of conduct that are more universally accepted among the local populace, and therefore the need and desire for government decreases, making that local government smaller in scale and scope. And in such smaller communities, the likelihood of people knowing each other or having only one degree of separation is very high. So reputation matters much more so than in an urban ocean of millions where anonymity among a crowd is the norm. This also makes the voluntary compliance with the local moral codes in small towns more likely, leading to a higher trust community than in big cities, and further diminishing the need for government regulations and policing in those rural areas. The density and close proximity of so many different people, cultures, and lifestyles within a city does itself tend to organically manifest one particular universal moral code, and that is tolerance for the different and diverse. While these living circumstances of increased diversity do inevitably on occasion give rise to conflict and aggression between identity groups, in order for a multicultural city to function at all, tolerance becomes a necessary and ultimate virtue, buttressed by constant promotion and reinforcement. And no other attribute or feature is so universally accepted as defining modern liberalism as tolerance. To coexist, as their bumper stickers declare, with different races, religions, cultures, and sexual identities. This does not necessarily imply that the inverse intolerance is held as a virtue or self-defining attribute of right-wing conservatism, but rather that it is simply not held in the highest regard among all the various human virtues, values, and positive traits that exist, as it is with modern liberals. And according to the psychological research, some of these other values, such as conscientiousness, honesty, loyalty, freedom, etc., are indeed held at higher regard by rightists and conservatives than they are by leftists and modern liberals. While the trait of tolerance or open-mindedness can potentially become expressed to a detrimentally excessive degree, such as a developed tolerance for crime, indecency, or mental illness, turning into indifference or even the celebration of such concerns, it is still generally a positive trait that is fostered by living in cities and one more associated with modern liberalism, and therefore another explanatory aspect of why urban residents tend to vote left. But it is important to understand that this is not the sole nor even primary driver behind the differing politics between urban and rural residents. If one does make this assumption, then they may be misled into thinking that rural political preferences may be reversed by simply increasing their exposure to certain ideological concepts or to more cultural diversity, when in fact there are many other elements that always have and always will reinforce the political divergence between these two environments, some of which I've already illustrated. Assuming that the entire political divide between cities and rural counties, as some do on both sides of the political spectrum, is entirely due to the ethnic and racial diversity common to most cities, can become an overtly simplistic and naive perspective, with some on the left who believe that as soon as one travels 50 miles outside the cities, racism and bigotry become a common and openly accepted feature of the culture of country folk, that those who reside a little upstate New York in the year 2023 apparently hold similar views to those in 1923 Alabama, and therefore vote differently based on that alone. And then there are those among both the left and the right who simply chalk up the differing majority voting patterns between cities and rural counties to political preferences that are inherent to bio-racial identities themselves. But neither of these presumptions explain how the same political divide continues to exist between cities and rural counties among all racial and ethnic groups. Not only whites, but also blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Indians, Jews, and Muslims all tend to vote more right-wing and Republican the further they live from cities. There is clearly more to this divergence in voting behavior than simply racial demography, or more frequent exposure to those with different skin color, or access to larger variety of ethnic cuisine. The sociological, psychological, and practical reasons why urban and rural areas diverge politically that I have been describing clearly apply to all people, regardless of their race or religion. But there is one more aspect worth noting, one that is related to demography, but not necessarily racially rooted demography, and that is the immigrant population and how their voting patterns relate to certain factors. As it is well known, foreign-born immigrants generally tend to localize in cities. Immigrants comprise up to an entire third of the population of many major cities and contribute to as much as 90% of the current population growth of cities. Many city populations would have been shrinking in size for decades were it not for the influx of foreign-born citizens. And immigrants vote Democrat by a factor of about 2 to 1. More than twice as many immigrants vote Democrat than do Republican. All of the reasons I've just laid out as to why city dwellers in general vote Democrat over Republican by factors as high as 4 to 1 still apply to immigrants who are living in cities and therefore are driven by those same factors of urban life to vote left. And this can be seen by the fact that immigrants who reside in rural counties, like every single other demographic, have a higher tendency to vote right than their urban counterparts. And once again, while some on both the left and the right simply reduce the voting patterns of immigrants to racial ancestry, if we take into account the fact that white immigrants coming from other Western nations also vote majority Democrat at far higher proportion than domestically born white citizens, then we can see that the pattern can not simply be boiled down to mere racial identity and heritage. The primary reason immigrants, whether white, black, brown, or Asian, vote majority Democrat is straightforward, but I want to preface the explanation with a little background to provide more substance. The United States is founded upon a set of ideals that were associated with Enlightenment-era liberalism, often referred to as classical liberalism. Unlike the Rousseauian French revolutionaries of the same period as America's founding, or the German idealist branch of Enlightenment thought which eventually led to Marxism and other materialist philosophies, the American founding also integrated the Christian philosophy, ethics, and traditions out of which Enlightenment liberalism itself had evolved. This made the United States unique among all the world's nations as one that upheld the natural, God-given rights of individuals as sovereign over the authority of the government, and with the government's primary role simply being the protection of those God-given rights. This premise was expanded upon and codified in the founding documents, and some of the key features to emerge from this premise include equality under the law, the right to act, communicate, and express oneself nonviolently, as secured by the First Amendment, and the right to defend one's life, property, and God-given rights, using violence if necessary to do so, as secured by the Second Amendment. Of course, it sadly took many generations and much bloodshed to finally implement these principles universally for all citizens, but they do nonetheless remain unique to the American Constitution and the nation as a whole among all others up to this very day, as we're still the only nation on earth that has freedom of speech, and the only nation that so centrally enshrines the right to self-defense, particularly as a balancing check against governmental power. Therefore, it is perfectly logical that these ideas will naturally seem more alien and difficult to grasp for people coming from other cultures and governmental systems which they're more used to and familiar with. And indeed, we can see this reflected in polling surveys which have shown that the majority of immigrant citizens are opposed to both the First and Second Amendments, in that they favor much stricter so-called hate speech laws and much stricter gun control laws than the domestic-born U.S. population does. And aside from such trends being a matter merely of understanding and support for American traditions or lack thereof, it's worth pointing out that these specific positions also relate to the focus of this piece regarding the divergent settings of urban population centers and towns and villages of the rural expanse. Since, perhaps, the arguments for more speech restrictions and gun control measures can more reasonably be made for the exceedingly more dense and culturally diverse populations of cities. For instance, in cities where massive, tightly packed crowds are far more commonplace, firing or even simply brandishing a weapon may be more likely to trigger a panic-driven stampede than in the less dense countryside where hunting and gun culture is more normalized, or where so many different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups must live side by side. Overtly offensive language in advertising or other public displays may be more likely to trigger violent reactions and thus necessitate more curtailing. Mind you, I'm not making an argument here one way or the other on such matters. I'm just pointing out how the local environment does bear an impact upon the effects of such policies and, in turn, the local population sentiment about them. But returning to the political persuasions of immigrant demographies specifically, given the foundational principles that make this country unique, by default, every single immigrant to the United States is coming from a more collectivist nation with more centralized government, so they will understandably have a tendency to vote for more collectivist and centralized government with which they are more familiar. The only immigrant groups that vote at much higher rates, or even sometimes majority right-wing Republican, for more individual and economic liberty and less centralized government, are those that fled nations which were more severely devastated by more radically leftist and communist governments, such as Cubans, Venezuelans, and Vietnamese, and therefore tend to vote opposite to the types of policies which they saw run amok in their previous homelands. But while many immigrants, particularly the non-white ones, are very culturally conservative due to being highly religious and traditionalist, the facts remain that, overall, immigrants vote Democrat by a factor of 2 to 1. Every year, 1 million immigrants enter the country legally and gain citizenship, and they mostly concentrate in the cities where their proportion of the overall urban population continues to rise. And so, this is one of a few reasons why cities can be expected to become increasingly more divergent and distinct from the surrounding areas in terms of politics and voting patterns over the foreseeable future, further increasing the contentions over political power unless these contrasting urban and rural areas are allowed to separate and govern themselves how they see fit to. Compounding this effect as well is the matter of illegal immigration. On top of the 1 million immigrants who enter the country legally every year, another million per year have been entering the country illegally for decades now, with that number exploding to somewhere between 2.5 and 4 million per year since the Biden administration began. The illegal immigrants concentrate in cities at even higher rates than legal immigrants, and their tendency to remain in relative poverty is vastly increased due to legal restrictions on employment opportunities, as well as the fact that they do tend to be low-skilled and poorly educated. This increased prevalence of poverty further adds to the urban inclination towards more comprehensive welfare systems. And since illegal immigrants tend to be even less acclimated to traditional American ideals and principles than those who willfully went through the long and arduous legal immigration process, while they do not vote, they will, however, tend to add to the leftist cultural milieu of cities by the mere fact of being part of the population and its communities, just as much as the highly educated cosmopolitans and ultra-wealthy tend to. And if amnesty and voting rights are ever granted to those tens of millions of illegal immigrants, the political contrast between cities and rural areas will become even more dramatically sharper and extreme, while the urban style of leftist Democrat politics will be increasingly forced upon the rural communities due to the massively increased voting bloc, further exacerbating the already intensely divided political climate. While I have been arguing that leftist politics do make more sense for urban communities, regardless of race or immigration status, and that cities should have more freedom to implement such policies by achieving statehood, it's also worth noting, just as a quick aside, that while first-generation immigrants may always lean left somewhat for reasons just described, the degree to which they currently skew so heavily towards leftism and their support for some policies that go against American traditions, such as speech and gun laws, is something that can be brought into more balance over time. Simply because for the past few generations, not only has there been no significant effort towards assimilation, aside from a simple civics test to gain citizenship, but there has also been a widespread anti-assimilation sentiment that instead saturates the environment, from pop culture, entertainment, to educational institutions, all tending to promote anti-American critiques and ideologies. And while many of these critiques, such as those against corporatism, consumerism, or imperialism, serve an important purpose and all have their place in a healthy discourse, when they supplant a sense of patriotism and respect for the country as the more mainstream perspective, there will be a coinciding decrease of understanding and acknowledgement of what makes the country uniquely good. And beyond the fact that it is more difficult to inspire and unify people around something that is hated rather than loved, some of the more recently popular critiques to take hold in the mainstream culture are actively divisive, such as the cultural and racial Marxism, which tends to foster resentment, victimhood mentality, and contentious division between groups rather than empowerment or cooperation and unity. These types of critical perspectives and stances in particular, while also often rooted in perfectly valid observations and grievances, inevitably fall short in unifying the widespread multi-ethnic national population under a shared experience, whereas the features that philosophically define the United States of America, such as individual liberty and responsibility, localized and restricted government, meritocracy, and so forth, are more empowering and universally accessible, and therefore more unifying. With some improved efforts from government and certain other institutions, explaining and promoting the unique ideas that define the USA to new immigrants from other places would have a dramatic effect, albeit a gradual one, in bringing more political balance to this demographic. But that tangential observation aside, the fact remains that the influx of immigrants, both legal and illegal, into cities, combined with the increasing migration out of cities by those who oppose Democrat and leftist-style governance and culture, means that the urban-rural political divide will continue to increase. Another important reason this divide will continue to grow is technology, and this will occur through three main effects. The first one is not as much of a driver of ideological separation as the latter two, but does have to do with the increased capacity for cities to become more autonomous and self-sufficient and less reliant on rural and generally external goods and resources. I am speaking of what has been referred to as hyperlocalization, which describes various techniques and emerging technologies that facilitate decentralized production. Localized manufacturing, utilizing the ever-advancing capabilities of 3D printing adfab and computer numerical control milling, reduces the need for importing parts and products from large specialized factories outside the city. And urban agriculture, through advances in indoor horticulture, vertical farming, and aquaponics, along with the growing popularity of rooftop and community gardens, can eventually quite dramatically reduce the city's dependence on rural farmlands, bolstering the local economy and the city's leverage and autonomy. Hyperlocalization technologies will benefit non-urban communities as well, but perhaps not quite to the same magnitude as for cities. Other technological changes, however, while also enhancing abilities of localities to become more independent, will additionally contribute to the growing political polarization itself. Advances in information and communication technologies will continue to increasingly facilitate remote working opportunities, allowing people who were previously limited to living in cities due to employment options to move out to more rural areas. Those that choose to exit and relocate will be the people who prefer country life to city life, in other words, more right-leaning people, further increasing the larger political self-sorting migration that has already been accelerating for the past few years. And the other way technological advancement will impact the increasing urban-rural divide is how network information technology will affect cities specifically. Living in a grid is inherently and highly suitable for technology. Complex systems with many quickly moving parts densely packed together is exactly what technology handles best. People who desire to live in cities are willing to relinquish certain freedoms and abide by increased sets of rules and regulations in order to enjoy the many conveniences, opportunities, and benefits of city life. And technology will continue to increasingly facilitate and enhance those conveniences and benefits through the growing implementation of networked objects, sensors, and biometric recognition technologies, along with the ever-increasing capabilities of artificial intelligence. Nearly all cities pursuing to become smart cities is inevitable. However, such an environment that necessarily entails drastically increased and centralized state control over personal finances and privacy through the combination of digitally enhanced marketplaces and identification with ubiquitous surveillance technology will also become less and less attractive to those with more right-wing or libertarian tendencies, while also gradually acclimating the urban population to increased collectivism and state power through all the incentives and benefits such technology provides, despite any detriments it may bring with it. This, as well, will ultimately have an effect on the type of people that move into or out of cities, largely based upon their political predilections. To some, the concept of relinquishing certain rights, protections, and degrees of privacy in order to live in such a highly networked technological smart city sounds rather dystopian and even difficult to understand how anyone might prefer it. But living in cities has always come with various costs and sacrifices. Aside from the lack of direct access to therapeutic raw nature or the increased potential exposure to crime, cities have also always had higher taxes and higher cost of living expenses. Yet, for generations, plenty of people have still romanticized and sought out living in cities nonetheless, despite the obvious challenges, downsides, and expenses that have always existed. Countless songs and movies celebrate the magic of living in a big city, while every little town has always had some residents who dream about eventually making their way to their metropolis of choice. I was born and raised in Manhattan during the 80s and 90s, and I utterly relished it. The constant electrifying novelty of new people, new music, new art, new fashions, new foods, and new experiences. So I understand it to be perfectly reasonable and fair that if you want to live in a big city teeming with a superabundance of entertainment and enrichment options, and all the forms of convenience inherent to city life, then one should expect to pay a high amount on rent and taxes and abide by certain strict regulations needed to maintain such a complex system. And, likewise, If you want to live in the peaceful expanses of nature, in the forests and mountains beside streams, rivers, and lakes, among birdsong and wildlife, under open skies filled with spectacular sunsets and vivid splashes of bright stars, then expect to bear more of the personal responsibilities and risks of living in the country and the rugged individualism that it so classically demands, but also get to enjoy the benefit of lower taxes, lower cost of living in general, and less government regulation and intrusion into one's life. Big cities and countrysides, two very different environments fostering very different lifestyles, each appealing to different people, each with positives and negatives, and each with their own very different needs for governance and management. Forcing either one to abide by rules set by the other is an inevitable recipe for contention, animosity, friction, and failure. It can be said that the entire political philosophy of the United States of America is based upon the decentralization of political power, such as through the checks and balances between the three separate branches of government, an armed citizenry as a check against government tyranny, and through the emphasis on localism detailed in the Constitution and the papers, pamphlets, and letters of the founders. The United States of America was originally designed so that states would have very high degrees of autonomy in how they manage their resources and govern their populations, based upon their differing natural terrains and cultural predilections. And an additional benefit of having such freedom to explore varying economic and governing strategies is that those different models would be tested for relative rates of success or failure over time, a laboratory of diverse governance structures, always evolving, adapting, learning from one another, and seeking the best possible outcomes for a locality. This is the reason they were and are still referred to as states, the same word used to refer to sovereign nations, and not simply provinces or districts, because they were designed to embody that level of sovereignty and self-determination, but still under a contract of certain minimal unifying principles and practical agreements. Borders have existed as long as there's been nation-states, empires, kingdoms, and even tribal territories, and they have always generally reflected some cultural or ethno-linguistic division or geological boundaries such as mountain ranges or rivers, which also often separate different types of natural terrains, which are in turn often reflected back again into the cultures based around how those differing terrains are managed. People of the mountains, or of the valleys, forests, farmlands, deserts, or coastal regions. Within the present United States of America, the most dramatic difference in both culture and terrain is that between the urban and the rural, yet that is not where the borders exist. The number of nation-states on Earth has quadrupled over the past century, due to secessions, separations, and declarations of more localized self-determination, most of which were achieved through nonviolent and democratic means. Yet, in the same amount of time, the number of U.S. states and the borders that outline them have generally remained unchanged. And many of these state lines drawn in previous centuries have simply become outdated, especially as what were once large towns and old cities grew into extremely highly populated mega-metropolises with increasingly divergent needs and desires from the more rural areas. While this political and cultural polarization between the two polities has been intensifying, it is not entirely new. Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers discussed the political implications of the growing cities and their voting tendencies, and some historians have described the tension between cities and country folk as ongoing for millennia. Tensions between the novelty, structure, and power of what has been referred to in the past as the empire of the city, and the more traditionalist ways of the people of the land. The term pagan was originally defined in Latin as people of the country, or people of the rural villages, but that it eventually became known and used instead as a derogatory term speaks to this rather ancient conflict between city dwellers and country dwellers. And it is this ancient tension that can be seen playing out today in the maps of our current political divide, and being increasingly amplified by modernity and technology. There have been a few books written recently about the debate over national secession, and in them they detail the benefits of smaller nation-states, showing how smaller countries are correlated with less corruption and a happier general population, and they offer explanations as per why. These observations and their underlying reasons are presented as arguments that many of the rising tensions among the U.S. populace and the various problems with the current U.S. government are due to its size, and that breaking up the Union into smaller countries would be of benefit. I'll address the idea of national secession later, but for now, I want to point out that the smaller is better arguments also translate to U.S. state-level governments. But if smaller is better, what about tiny? What about city-sized states? When addressing size, we can talk about population numbers or geographical size. As for population size, here are some facts to put the numbers in perspective. Bearing in mind that smaller nations with populations under 6 million, from Luxembourg at 500,000 to Norway at 5.5 million, tend to be very successful and happier than the USA and other massive nations, note that half of the entire world's nations have less population than the city of New York at 8 million. The top 10 most populous U.S. cities have larger populations than a quarter of the Earth's nations. Currently, there are just as many U.S. cities with populations above 500,000 as there are sovereign nations with populations below 500,000. That number is 37, meaning 37 U.S. cities are larger than approximately 37 currently existing nations. New York City alone, just the city, not the state, has a larger population than 37 of the 50 U.S. states. And if California were broken up into 62 separate states with equal populations, each one of those new states would still have a larger population than Vermont or Wyoming. And some people actually think that merely breaking up Cali into 2 states is somehow extreme and preposterous. So obviously population is of no matter nor concern when contemplating the creation of city-sized U.S. states, but what about geography? For this question, we can look to some examples of nations that are comprised of nothing but a city. No farmlands, oil fields, mineral mines, nor forests of timber. Actual city-states urbanized from border to border, such as Monaco, Singapore, Hong Kong, and many others throughout history, have become very wealthy and successful. Monaco, at less than a single square mile, is the second smallest sovereign state in the world after Vatican City, and has a per capita GDP nearly 4 times as high as the USA, and the lowest poverty rate among all nations. Monaco also has the highest life expectancy on the planet at 89.5 years old. Singapore is significantly larger than Monaco, but is still a completely urbanized sovereign city-state. It has the 5th largest per capita GDP in the world, and an extremely low unemployment rate. Monaco and Singapore are also 2 of the most densely populated countries in the world. People want in, not out. Hong Kong, also one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, experienced incredible economic growth and prosperity as a city-state during the 20th century, and for the recent decades that it remained mostly autonomous despite technically falling under China's jurisdiction in 1997. How well it fares as China takes increasing control over the city will serve as an example of whether cities function better with more or less autonomy. There are other modern examples of successful city-states and microstates that are also not technically completely sovereign but enjoy near total autonomy and self-governance outside the jurisdiction of the host nation. Examples of functionally autonomous city-states include the ethnically and religiously diverse cities between Spain and Morocco, Ceuta, Melilla, and the economically robust Gibraltar. And there is the functionally autonomous city-state of Macau in China, which is one of the top 10 tourism destinations on the planet and boasts one of the highest GDP per capita incomes and the fourth highest life expectancy in the world, while also being the world's most densely populated region and highly urbanized and modern. And there's Dubai, the extremely wealthy and rapidly developing city, which enjoys a high degree of autonomy from the UAE. Switzerland has a federalist structure similar to the US. In fact, their constitution was very much based off the US Constitution. However, their 26 cantons, the equivalent of our states, are tiny in comparison, with an average population of 250,000 per canton, while US states are an average 7 million. The canton of Basel-Stadt in Switzerland, which mainly consists of the city of Basel, is a city that enjoys vastly more economic, social, and political autonomy from Switzerland than a U.S. state does relative to our federal government, making it similar to a city-state in many regards. And Basel is not only a major economic center of Europe with its centuries-old chemical and pharmaceutical industry, it's also regarded as a major cultural center of Europe with over 40 museums, 25 theaters, and countless art galleries, and has also been an intellectual and academic hub of Europe for many centuries. There are many examples of thriving city-states from history, but while there are not as many today, the examples I listed all demonstrate how an urban population center, a city alone, can function incredibly successfully and as good, if not better, than most larger nations. And while there are not many nations territorially limited to a single city today, as in past centuries, there are many very small nations which are comprised of a single city with a small amount of surrounding terrain, such as the very small microstate nation of San Marino, which, despite being only 24 square miles in size and doesn't even have a port, being landlocked inside of Italy, is the oldest republic in the world, established in 300 AD, and for the past 415 years has not experienced any significant change to its boundaries nor its form of government, demonstrating the potential long-term stability of a city-state. Or the 300-year-old microstate of Liechtenstein, the sixth smallest nation in the world, which also has the highest GDP per person in the world, or Andorra, another landlocked microstate in Europe that also boasts an extremely strong economy and one of the highest life expectancies in the world, or Brunei in Southeast Asia, the fifth richest nation in the world with the fifth highest GDP per capita, and Malta, the small island nation and tourism destination just south of Sicily, with its advanced economy, along with various other small island nations that exist with very high GDP per capita, from the Isle of Man to Bermuda. And there are also examples of moderately larger yet still very small nations that remain economically successful. For example, the European landlocked nation of Luxembourg, which is smaller than Rhode Island, has a population of only 500,000, much smaller than most American cities, and has maintained its existence as a sovereign country for 1,000 years, and has the world's highest or second highest GDP per capita, depending on which estimate one uses. So, any arguments based on economics or land size or urbanization of that land all seem to favor cities enjoying increased political autonomy, not less. Also worth pointing out is that while some of the sovereign and semi-sovereign city-states and micronations are known for their success by embracing capitalist free market economics, smaller nations are also known to handle welfare states and democratic socialist policies better as well. A more closely shared environment and shared needs means more similar interests and political unanimity to build government programs upon. As the current cultural and political polarization continues to intensify, Forcing the policies demanded by one half of the population onto the other half will only further inflame tensions and arouse anger, especially among whichever half is not in power at the time. States are engaging in increasingly open defiance of federal laws regarding issues like migration, abortion, and both gun rights and gun restrictions. Some degree of increased separation and decentralization of authority, allowing more self-governance among politically and culturally divergent populations, is absolutely inevitable and unavoidable. If this separation of powers is not allowed to occur peacefully through political negotiation and compromise, it will occur through the nightmarish eruption of widespread violence, devastation, and death that is war. This is the least desirable route of achieving the necessary changes. A national secession, however, does not have to entail war, as many examples of new nations splitting off from old ones through a completely amicable and peaceful process exist, and from which we can draw lessons and inspiration should a national secession ever become what a large majority of the population demands. It goes without saying that this is infinitely more preferable than a second civil war, or third if we count the Revolution, which was technically also a civil war of secession. But there are still tremendously difficult and complicated challenges that would accompany even a peaceful national secession. Splitting up smaller nations or smaller ethnically distinct territories breaking off of a much larger empire are one thing, but dividing a country in half that is so massive in both size and numbers, and that also happens to be the most economically and militarily powerful nation in the world by far, brings extra obstacles. These obstacles can theoretically be overcome, and perhaps I'll return to exploring the ways they can be and what an actual breakup of the USA might look like in a future video, since it is interesting to explore these hypothetical solutions. But for the purpose of the argument I'm currently presenting, I will just point out how serious these obstacles are, such as deciding custody of things like military assets and bases. And of course, the matter of national defense becomes complicated if the military itself is split up and it becomes possible for the newly separated nations to form differing alliances with foreign powers. This was one of the main reasons for replacing the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution when it was learned through experience that collective defense was one of the select areas that do perform better at scale and with more centralized structure and command. Another major impetus behind replacing the Articles with the Constitution was the problem of interstate trade barriers. Today, so much trade and commerce happens across state lines that a conversion of much of the state borders into national ones with newly implemented restrictions and tariffs could be extremely disruptive to the overall economy and the flow of goods. Free trade agreements could be made between newly separated nations, but it is not guaranteed, and disputes and disagreements can easily escalate into trade wars. The custody of federal lands, many of which are rich in resources, would be very difficult to deliberate. And there's the matter of federally funded infrastructure, much of which spans extensively enough that it would cross any new borders drawn between new nations. Negotiations over debt burdens and divvying up the national debt itself could prove to be a contentious and difficult challenge. Complicated decisions would have to be made regarding non-discretionary budgets and the recipients of federal benefit distributions, such as from the VA to veterans, Social Security payments, Medicaid, and other forms of welfare. With the new nation also comes new monetary policy and therefore the need for a new currency, which all markets, including retail, would have to adopt along with the inevitably changing conversion rates. The logistical obstacles range from minor to very serious, and there are many of them. But then there's also the sentimental factor, which could pose just as significant impedance to breaking up the country. For many, it would be sad accepting the end of the United States, and feel somewhat like an admission of defeat and failure of the American experiment. And it would require that many of those with strong affection for American history to relinquish ownership of much of their material heritage. Even though DC's population votes 95% Democrat, would patriotic Republicans really be comfortable letting the modern left, who do tend to be less reverent of American history and founders, have complete ownership and control of all the monuments, memorials, cemeteries, museums, and historical landmarks and buildings, from the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials to the White House, that make up the nation's capital? Not to mention all the historical sites and monuments in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and other cities so entwined with the storied birth and early days of the nation. If national secession ever emerges as the only remaining option, then a peaceful separation, however complicated and challenging, is preferable to a violent one. But before we get to that point, we must at least first try to return to a more decentralized federalism, which was the norm for the first 150 years of the nation as it successfully grew from 13 colonial states to the world's most dominant and wealthy superpower. And while I am pleased and encouraged by the growing advocacy for federalism among various politicians over the past few years, a return to increased states' rights and autonomy is only half of the necessary solution. The American colonies that eventually became states were originally formed and delineated by the different types of communities that grew within those diverse terrains, based not only upon the varying lifestyles and economies tied to the localized natural resources and environments, but also around differing European ethnic groups, folkways, and religious sects, each emphasizing their own varying value systems, customs, and cultures, and allowing each state to govern themselves according to their own unique values and expertise in their local environments was a centrally important feature that has, in large part, defined the United States of America as a nation. Along with a return to federalism, we need intrastate secessions and new state lines drawn along the true boundaries between the differing social, cultural, economic, and environmental ecosystems of the modern age. And today, the most contrasting natural ecosystems and bioregions are not just deserts, mountains, farmlands, or separated water basins, but urban cities and the rural surrounds, which also happen to reflect the most contrasting political and cultural divides by far. If the Blue Islands and Red Seas are to remain under the same state governments and legislatures, the dissatisfaction and fighting will only continue to escalate, but probably get even worse if we do manage to successfully return power to states in an effort to increase decentralized federalism. Because the red states will then become more free to impose more conservative laws upon the progressive blue cities within them, and the blue cities will impose more leftist policies upon the more conservative, non-urban counties. This is another reason that a return to mere federalism without intrastate secessions and redrawing of state lines is simply not enough to resolve our problems. Along with the fact that urban and rural environments and the inhabitants of each will only continue to become more and more divergent as this century progresses due to technological and migratory changes discussed earlier. Social and political conflict has already gotten so heated that talk about national divorce and national secession has fully entered the mainstream. But simply redrawing state borders by allowing portions of states to secede into new ones or join neighboring ones is infinitely easier, less dramatic, less complicated, less risky, and more logically based upon the actual political and cultural divides and where they exist. And even if one believes full secession and separation into new sovereign nation states is the ultimately ideal solution or inevitable eventual outcome, a move towards increased federalism, states' rights, and localism would be a good stepping stone in that direction, a helpful transitional phase if it ended up not being sufficient in resolving the differences and the remaining disputes over federal power and purse. And the new borders already established between urban and rural territories will contribute to much better lines along which to separate new sovereign nation states. So, if one does fully support national secession, there is no reason not to also support state-level secessions. There aren't many objections I can think of to this recommendation of city-state formation via intrastate secessions. Only 6 come to mind currently, but I am interested in hearing any other concerns or arguments against what I'm suggesting, so if I don't address a particular argument or objection, please share it as a comment below. The first objection is a minor one, being the concern that pursuing such a route continues to foster the already divisive trajectory and atmosphere which our country is currently suffering, and that if the right political leader gets elected with a compelling enough message of unity which appeals to a large enough supermajority of citizens, then some great spiritual awakening may ensue, taking the place of our current path towards increasingly tense and hostile polarization, and returning us to a political normalcy of decades past. Of course, most of us would love to see such a scenario unfold, and our hopes are that it may, regardless of how realistic or probable we perceive it to be. But even if such a reconciliatory revivification is accomplished, the decentralization of governance to more local levels and the redefining of those localities based upon the regional differences in environment and culture, instead of the completely arbitrary cartographic divisions that currently exist, would be of no less value. All the arguments I've laid out still apply, even if we were successfully ushered into some kind of optimistic national renaissance. And if such a scenario were to fail in its materialization or execution, then the need for new state lines remains the only viable remedy to at least partially quell and resolve our increasing unrest. The urban-rural political divide has been increasing for decades now. There was always some political divergence between the two environments and their constituencies, going all the way back to the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debates regarding the composition of the Constitution, and even further back into history as discussed earlier. But if we observe how our electoral maps have changed over just the past few decades, we can see a dramatic shift from political differences being based more upon general regions such as North, South, Midwest, or West, to becoming quite starkly delineated between the urban and rural terrains across the entire nation. And as I explained previously, this trend towards increased distinction and divergence between the two will only continue to accelerate and intensify, and therefore deserves to be attended to and somehow addressed, regardless of how optimistic or pessimistic the national sentiment should become. The second concern is also a rather minor one, and that is that if this strategy leads to increasingly differentiated local governance, where increased federalism leads to conservative states becoming more conservative and progressive ones more progressive, and even more so if state lines are redrawn to reflect the urban-rural political divide, then that would be unfair to those who are political minorities in their respective areas, being forced to deal with even more of the policy that they object to, lest they relocate to a new state. But as I said, this is a relatively minor issue because while moving may certainly be a major challenge for some, For most people, it's not that big of a deal. On average, 40% of Americans live in a state they were not born in, with some states having much higher percentages, such as Nevada, where 75% were born somewhere else. Also, not only does the creation of new states by dividing urban from rural areas, as I'm suggesting, mean that everyone will be much closer to both a red or blue state to which they can move, it also means that a vastly larger portion of people will suddenly find themselves residing in a state they prefer more than they currently do, with residents of Republican counties no longer living in blue states and residents of urban Democrat counties no longer living in a red state. And perhaps in the interest and benefit of increasing general happiness and avoidance of civil conflict, funds created by federal, state, or private interests can be organized to help those people relocate who require financial assistance to do so. States are generally looking to increase their population, so there is economic incentive to encourage those with like minds seeking to join them. A third concern, also regarding the effect of allowing states to become increasingly partisan and politically divergent through increased federalism, and then to an even higher degree by separating urban and rural areas into different states, is the matter of parental disputes. Law-abiding adults will always have the liberty to travel and move freely between the states as long as we remain a single nation, and therefore be able to travel to another state and engage in any behaviors legal in that state without needing to first become a resident, such as gambling, drugs, soliciting prostitution, acquiring an abortion, hunting certain game, the use of certain firearms in hunting or on gun ranges, and various other actions with restrictions that vary from state to state. But when one parent consents to bringing a minor to another state to engage in activity that is illegal for that minor in the home state, and the other parent objects, then this raises some complicated legal questions and potential legal battles between state governments. The two main examples of such disputes involve abortion and gender-related surgical and pharmaceutical interventions for minors. In the first case, it's not about what the minor is allowed to do, but rather what the mother is allowed to do to the developing fetus. In most cases of abortion, especially those of the first trimester, which comprise the vast majority, either the father is not aware of the pregnancy or agrees to the procedure, be it willingly or reluctantly. But in an established relationship or a marriage, the longer the pregnancy progresses, the more a father can become emotionally attached to the developing fetus, just as the mother normally does. And there has already arisen at least one instance where an 8-month pregnant wife became irate with her husband and traveled to another state where such extremely late-term abortions are legal and underwent the procedure merely to spite the husband. Most will probably say such an act is unfortunate, but that neither the father nor the home state representing him has any feasible recourse to address the situation. But to more than half of the population, including a majority of women, an abortion of a viable fetus that could be delivered and easily survive is equivalent to murder. And situations such as this one, if they do begin to happen more frequently, will flare up strong emotions on both sides of the debate. And the matter of parental disputes over irreversible gender-related surgical and pharmaceutical interventions for minors is a much more legally problematic scenario, since the argument doesn't involve any debated rights of an adult mother to have an abortion, but rather those of a non-emancipated minor who is under equal custodianship of both parents. And this scenario has already arisen numerous times, where one parent decides to bring the child to another state to undergo such procedures where they are legal, while the other parent objects. When one parent and one state consider these interventions beneficial and the human right of the child, and the other parent and the home state sees them as permanently damaging medical malpractice and horrific abject child abuse, more serious allegations of parental abduction and potential traumatic physical injury to minors become the grounds for interstate legal contests. I'm taking the time to detail these issues because they are very significant debates in the escalating culture wars and will only increase in their prevalence and therefore demand attention and contemplation. However, when it comes to these matters being an argument against increased autonomy and the ensuing political variance between states through the redrawing of state lines, I do not find it to be very compelling, merely due to the fact that this problem is already arising and will continue to be an issue regardless if the city-state solution is implemented or not. And while increased political autonomy of states and more easy access to those states with different laws due to increased proximity of newly formed city-states may perhaps increase the frequency of such instances, I still firmly believe that the benefits to both sides of such debates outweigh such difficulties, such as no longer being forced to pay taxes that fund activities one so deeply objects to, or being able to more freely and cohesively cultivate communities around shared values and influence other constituencies and the culture at large by leading through example. Perhaps a federal-level family court must be constructed to determine which parent most has the child's ultimate best interest at heart when the laws of two different states conflict on such matters. I don't know, but I do know that this is a growing challenge we are already facing in our bifurcating world and needs to be deliberated regardless of whether we add any new states to the Union. And as I said, and have explained over the course of this work, giving the differing populations within the more and less urban areas more political autonomy may bring some new challenges, but it solves incomparably more. Another objection I have heard to the city-state solution is that the vast majority of the population do not live in either blue cities or red rural counties, but rather the purple suburbs, and the separation of cities disregards this majority. But this too is a minor objection, because as research has shown, the political demographics of populations do generally exist along a distinct spectrum from left to right, directly depending on proximity to a city. And so if left-leaning suburban counties nearest to the cities wish to vote to either join the seceding city or not join the seceding red counties, they can. And if the political leanings of counties are split geographically, then county lines are even easier to adjust than state lines, so that is entirely feasible as well. And as for any perfectly purple 50-50 suburbs, whether or not they end up in a new state governed by the other party is not really relevant nor a drastic change from the current situation, given their general neutrality. The fifth objection I hear to such efforts is the matter of how much federalism, localism, and decentralization of power has fallen out of favor with the modern left, and therefore how much they would resist and fight against such efforts. I would first remind such objectors that, as I mentioned in the beginning of this piece, Democrats, on average, do favor national secession at a higher rate than Republicans. And while this desire to exit may not translate directly into a desire to allow their counterparts to exit, either from the Union or from their respective Democrat states, I do believe this indicates that the resistance to these ideas among the general left-leaning population may not be as strong as many on the right presume. that perhaps the anti-decentralization sentiment is coming more from the political leadership and Democrat-run media than from the Democrat voters themselves. However, there is still some truth to this concern over resistance to increased federalism and intrastate secessions coming primarily from the left, at least more so than from the right. While leftism and the Democrat Party have long been more associated with big government programs, centralized authority, and managed economy than the American right, especially since the advent of the progressive movement in the 1920s and 30s, they have also at times aligned themselves in vocal support for decreased centralized authority and increased individual and local autonomy on various issues. From the anti-draft, free speech, and back to the land movements of the 1960s and 70s hippies and counterculturalists, to the cyberpunk promise of a decentralized society via networked ICTs during the early days of the internet in the 90s and 2000s, and also notably the states' rights to decriminalize cannabis regardless of what federal law decrees. And while the push towards states' rights and more localized authority does still reemerge among the left when Republicans are holding power, with secession campaigns such as CalExit and DemExit, or the flouting of federal law with sanctuary cities and non-compliance with ICE or INS, nonetheless, a general trend against localism and state-level autonomy and towards increased federal power has become much more of the norm among the left over the past decade or two, where it now appears that Republican states and counties are, for the most part, perfectly fine to leave the Democrat ones alone, but the Democrat stance is, for the most part, opposite to this, and currently seeks to impose its will over all with an increasingly centralized and powerful federal government and bureaucracy. Although there is also a growing contingent of the reactionary right that believes the only way to thwart the left's cultural and political agenda from gaining total hegemonic power is to wield power in the same totalizing and centralized fashion, but in the opposite direction. So, on one hand, the content of this treatise is directed at this particular strand of neo-reactionaries as an imploration to explore and exhaust all remaining options of power decentralization before resolving to endorse more brute force strategies. But on the other hand, since these represent a small minority of the general right wing, which mostly still prefers decentralized federalism as opposed to the general left wing, which mostly does not, the main task we face as supporters of both federalism and intrastate secessions is to convince enough of the left-wing population, those who are not adamantly opposed to localism and decentralization, and who are not in favor of totalitarianism nor civil war, that this is the best solution which will allow them to manifest the most of their desired leftist policies and ideologies within their own states and city-states. Much of the content of this piece contains many rational arguments as to why urban populations naturally lean so heavily left and always will, why they should therefore be allowed to explore their leftward inclinations unencumbered by voters and legislators from the more rural right-wing counties of their states, and why separating from rural counties to form new states is the only real way to facilitate that. And as for those who staunchly believe progressive cultural values and leftist economic policies are the inevitable future for all humanity, not just city dwellers, further arguments can be made to them, such as that by successfully implementing their strategies to the fullest within their own territories, they may then influence the rest of America to voluntarily follow suit and copy more and more of their politics, economics, and culture, as opposed to trying to force it upon the non-urban right, which only triggers and upsets those tragically naive yet heavily armed hillbillies. Or that if the other states refuse to change and follow their successful examples, they can look forward to welcoming the influx of migration, money, business, and trade that would inevitably flock to their shining bastions of prosperity and modernity. As I mentioned earlier, some on the right believe that if the leftist cities were given free rein to implement their most desired policies, that it would lead to a collapse into poverty and crime. But I have also explained why leftist policies do indeed make more sense in cities and have higher degrees of success when the constituency is more politically unified. So, perhaps the cities will need to experiment over time in order to discover the happiest median between center and extreme left policies, but they can only do this if they are given the freedom to focus on governing themselves as opposed to engaging in constant battle with the rest of the state or with the federal government should it once again be taken control of by conservative Republicans. In making these arguments to leftists, it's helpful to remind them that the idea that the population as a whole is just continually becoming more and more progressive was somewhat disproven by the 2016 election upset, and that the pendulum could swing radically back towards not just Republican control of the executive and both houses of Congress, but very paleoconservative and religious traditionalist Republicans at that. In which case, increased federalism gives Democrat states more freedom to enact the policies they prefer, unless one lives in a Democrat-majority city within a Republican-majority state, which is why it is in those cities' best interest to separate and become a new state unto themselves. And again, even blue cities in blue states will gain immeasurably more freedom to become that much deeper blue by allowing the red counties to separate, and thereby no longer having to struggle and compromise with the other more right-wing counties represented in their state houses. Even if the mainstream cultural space, from music and movies to institutional academia and news media, continues to be controlled by leftist progressives for generations to come, many communities and population groups will never give up their traditions and religious values that have sustained them for thousands of years. History is one long consistent proof that people will suffer endless hardships and persecutions and readily fight and die in wars to protect their cultural and religious heritages. Eventually, the left simply must come to terms with the fact that large portions of the population will always insist on maintaining certain traditionalist values, lifestyles, and social structures. We can perhaps help them realize this sooner rather than later by reminding them that progressives have essentially already learned to tolerate the traditional gender roles and modesty rituals that are culturally enforced within Muslim, Jewish, Amish, Sikh, Hindu, and tribal indigenous communities, so it does not have to be such a giant leap to learn to accept as well that many modern Christians also choose to adopt traditional strictures and practices and simply allow them to exist in peace. Especially if they, as progressives, can feel more secured and protected from having such strictures forced upon them by living in reshaped states that represent much stronger solidarity among deeply Democrat urban and suburban areas. In combination, with a federal government that is reoriented towards drastically less encroachment upon the political autonomy of those states. Another point of argumentation in persuading the left toward the city-state solution is in regard to abortion, an issue so contentious that people on both extremes of the debate have proven willing to resort to violence over it, where right-wing and religious people will never, ever stop trying to restrict or fully prohibit the practice within their regions, and left-wingers will never, ever allow a total ban within their regions. If cities separate to form new states, then the distance to abortion clinics from areas with bans or heavy restrictions will be dramatically reduced. Instead of possibly having to drive across 3 red states to reach a clinic, the nearest large city, turned city-state, will be much more conveniently closer. In the context of this plea to consider the city-state solution, I am not declaring a position on such partisan matters as abortion, because I'm simply striving to appeal to both sides. So do not take these statements as advocacy for such actions, but rather a demonstration of a real and straightforward argument one can make to further persuade a leftist or pro-abortion individual. And this argument regarding increased proximity of states or city-states with different laws would also apply to other deeply contested partisan matters, which may be disturbing to rightists, but nonetheless will appeal to some leftists, such as gender-related surgical and pharmaceutical interventions for minors when both parents consent, as opposed to the much more legally complex and difficult situation of parental disputes discussed earlier. Or whatever other novel and politically charged biomedical practices gain traction as this century progresses, from assisted suicide to gene editing or something else unforeseen. To me, all these points and pretty much everything I've elaborated over the course of this entire work should be more than sufficient in convincing most Democrat voters that this route of redrawing state lines in combination with increased federalism, a shift of power and control away from the central government to the individual states, is the best solution to our increasingly strained and dangerous levels of political polarization. Which leads me to mentioning the last of the 6 objections and obstacles to this plan moving forward. And that is not the mere reluctance of a large portion of leftists, but the outright raging resistance to it that will come from those whose entire life purpose is the accrual and possession of power. I'm speaking of certain individuals within government, both Democrats and Republicans, both elected officials as well as non-elected bureaucrats, as well as various billionaires and leaders in the multinational corporate space, and the sycophantic propaganda mouthpieces in the legacy news industry that eagerly serve them all. Anything that truly benefits the purpose of increasing freedom, peace, and prosperity for the people, they will frantically decry as tyrannical, dangerous, and ruinous, because the decentralization of power and a true diversity of governance, lifestyle, and market options threatens their centralized, totalitarian, monopolistic control over the masses and the economic exploitation that grants them. The only thing that can prevent the masses from believing the lies and propaganda pushed by this powerful faction of controlling elites is if the counter-narrative, the truth, becomes widespread enough and presented in a clear and understandable enough fashion. So that's why I've taken the time to present and flesh out this idea. And if you agree that this may potentially be the only way to avoid terrible, deadly, and devastating conflict in the future, as well as perhaps a way to open doors towards a new era of flourishing creativity, productivity, freedom, and a more dynamic and harmonious domestic climate, then I hope you'll share and promote this article or video with whom you can to spread the word and encourage further discussions and perhaps actions towards manifesting this solution.